Great.
So I'm Carrington Hilson. I am the elk research biologist for coastal Northern California. So I oversee the research and management of elk in Del Norte, Humboldt, and Mendocino counties.
Great. And thanks for that lovely introduction, Justin, and for having us. And my name is Micaela Gunther. As Justin mentioned, I'm a professor at Cal Poly Humboldt in the Department of Wildlife. And I work on a variety of species around here on the North Coast that include carnivores such as bears and Humboldt martens and fishers. And I enjoy working with elk with my colleague Carrington here. We've been working together for almost a decade on these elk, and I've known Carrington for almost twice that long with her connection here at Cal Poly Humboldt, formerly Humboldt State University. And we're really pleased to share our stories about elk with you tonight. Thanks. Carrington, I'll kick us off.
Perfect. All right. Elk on California's North Coast. So just a very brief kind of overview of what we'll cover tonight. We'll kind of do a very broad overview of elk in California and the history. We'll look specifically at the North Coast and Mendocino elk management units. We'll talk about some of the objectives that the state has for elk. And then we'll move into a lot of the research and the projects that we have underway at Cal Poly Humboldt. So there are actually 4 subspecies of elk in North America. So the first one is the Rocky Mountain elk. They actually have the largest antlers of any of the subspecies, and they're predominantly found Rocky Mountains and west. There is actually a small population over on the East Coast currently. Next subspecies is the Tule elk, which is the smallest of all the subspecies, and they only exist in California. Then we have the Roosevelt elk, which are also referred to as Olympic elk. They are the largest of all the subspecies, and they have this darker coat coloration. They only exist in the Pacific Northwest. Then finally, we have Manitoban elk. They're found in the Midwestern United States and up into Canada. So one thing that's really interesting, I think, as we talk about the story of elk in California is that we do have 2 extinct species of elk. One of those is the eastern elk, which was the last one was harvested in 1877 in Pennsylvania. I always want to call them Pennsylvanian elk, but that's very wrong. And then we had the Manitoban elk that were basically in the arid lands of the Southwest, so Texas, Arizona, New Mexico, and they extended down into Mexico. They were extirpated by 1906. So a similar story about extirpation actually kind of occurred in California. Fortunately, we didn't lose any of our species. But what's interesting to note is that by the early 1900s, harvesting an elk was illegal in the state of California. It carried a 2-year penalty in jail. So we've come a long way since then. So to kind of give you an idea, historically, we had elk covering most of California with our 3 subspecies. And you can see that middle map is by 1970, after we had started conservation efforts. And this map on the far right is getting a little old at this point, from 2016. Since then, we've seen actually some range expansion on our subspecies. But I think what's interesting to note here is that elk used to cover the majority of the landscape. By the 1900s, the majority of the populations were gone, and now we're seeing these healthy, rebounding populations across the state. So let's talk about our subspecies. So the Rocky Mountain elk only occur in the northeastern portion of the state. So that includes Lassen, Modoc, Shasta, Siskiyou, and Tehama counties. Right now, we are seeing that these populations are extending further and further south into Sierra and Plumas County. So right now we're looking at a population of about 1,500 elk. So Tule elk. Historic populations for this subspecies were estimated at about 500,000. So today we're looking at about maybe 5,700 elk, and that estimate's probably low. And they range from Mendocino down to Kern County. So these elk were brought down to only 5 individuals by 1870. And that was on one ranch. And through conservation efforts, clearly they've rebounded. So they're a really amazing subspecies because they're the only elk subspecies that are adapted to open and dry conditions. And lastly, Roosevelt elk. So they're in northwestern California. So the counties are Del Norte, Humboldt, Mendocino, Shasta, Siskiyou, and Trinity. So I always thought they were just kind of limited to the coastal areas, but they extend kind of over into the Marble Mountains and down. So their populations, as with the other subspecies, had declined by the 1800s. Now we're looking at around 5,700 elk. And these elk are pretty difficult to survey. We'll touch on this in a minute because they really, they enjoy this area of dense canopy and steep terrain. So the areas that we're focusing on, right, are the North Coast and Mendocino Elk Management Units, or EMUs. Basically, it's just a designation that we have to set tag quotas and our goals and objectives for these areas. So how did we bring these guys back, right? What's kind of that story of going from elk covering the state of California to all these like tiny remnant populations to now what we have today? So these populations on the North Coast were extremely restricted to pretty much just Prairie Creek. So we had these tiny little remnant populations. That population actually served to be the source population for the elk that were moved down into Mendocino County, as well as up into Del Norte. So the ones in Del Norte actually were deemed unsuccessful, but the ones in Mendocino, which will be on the next slide, 17 elk from that population have done quite well. And if you're in Whitethorn, you know that they are really thriving down there. So we kind of lost track of those elk for quite some time. They were monitored until 1983, basically just, a year. But we did see them moving further south. So the Tule elk in Mendocino, there was 4 basically distinct relocation efforts. One at Lake Pillsbury, one at Shamrock Ranch, which is just south of Laytonville. Then we had another in Baxter Ranch, which is further inland from Laytonville, and another one at Diamond H, which is further east. So one very kind of interesting part to all of this that we just, this paper was just published by Ben Sachs out of UC Davis. So he collected DNA from elk statewide for quite some time. And what we have is basically these. So what you can see over here on, I'm having a hard time pointing. How do I do this? Can y'all see my pointer? Can you see my pointer or no?
Yes, I can see your mouse.
So here we are, right? Del Norte and Humboldt counties up here on the top. And so it's showing our relocation efforts, right? So this would be the elk from Prairie Creek moving down to the Kings Range. So then it also shows movement of our Tule elk. And what happened up here, this is elk from Oregon that we actually relocated over into Siskiyou County. So what's interesting to note is that these populations are actually genetically distinct. So when you look over on this far right map, so these blue dots are elk that actually originated from Oregon. And so right here, this line actually is predominantly the Klamath River. And then down here, we have the elk that originated from Prairie Creek. And then we have Rocky Mountains, right? So we have this actually line of some hybridization occurring between Rocky Mountain and Roosevelt elk. And what's very interesting to note is this little red circle right here. Next slide. So what that little red circle is actually a zone of hybridization between our Roosevelt and Thule elk. So up here in the corner, right, those are those Prairie Creek elk. And then this is that hybridization area. So we had a ton of elk. They were extirpated. They've been rebounding with kind of, I mean, to be honest, minimal conservation efforts from the department. We did some translocation efforts, but these elk have done, I mean, amazing. And unfortunately, we didn't have a ton of information. So what happened? The department decided that it was about time to basically do some intensive investigation into these populations, but these populations aren't easy to survey. So one of the first things we did is we started collaring elk. Right now to date, we've collared 134 elk. The majority of those have been in Humboldt County just because I've been collaring here longer. And Humboldt, when you look at the North Coast EMU, the majority of the population for the two counties combined actually reside in Humboldt County. It wasn't until 2022 that we were able to start collaring elk in Mendocino. And those two elk that we've collared in Trinity are actually Island Mountain elk, and they it's a little area that encompasses Trinity, Mendocino, and Humboldt counties. So what these collars are good for is for understanding distribution, space use, and to determine what an actual herd is. So here you can see the little tiny all the different colored points. So every 6.5 hours, I get a point from an elk. And when you analyze that data, it'll give you a home range, which these are these big blobs that you see on the map. So over time, as we continue to collar elk, we get more and more delineation of these separate groups of elk. And we can actually look at shifts in habitat use over time and identify basically survey areas that will help us later on to estimate abundance. So abundance, minimum counts, all the things that we need to better manage this species. So direct counts are great. Normally we do it through aerial surveys. As I mentioned earlier, Humboldt and Del Norte and some of Mendocino, aerial surveys, you can't do it. There's just, the terrain is too steep, the vegetation is too thick. Road surveys work for some areas where elk are highly habituated and close to roadways on kind of flat ground. But once again, road surveys are limited by the amount of area that you can access from a roadway. So what we've kind of done over time is we get the best count we can get, and we look at that count data and basically a trend over time. So is the population increasing or declining? All the data we have from pretty much all of our EMUs statewide is that the populations are increasing. So the more innovative ways that we've started to look at how many elk exist on the landscape is through fecal DNA spatial capture recapture, which the math behind that's pretty complex, but in a nutshell, we go out and we collect elk pellets and send them to the lab, and they genetically identify individuals. And from that data, we end up getting an estimate of abundance. The other thing we've been doing is putting out game cameras. Those cameras, we need to have collared individuals to know where the elk actually are in the landscape to dictate where the cameras go. But through that, so you look at the time it takes to detect an animal on a camera, and it's actually a method that's utilized for fish surveys, and you get an estimate of abundance. So it's some of these methods are novel. We have not been utilizing them, and so we're trying to figure out the best method for each area along the coast. And the other thing that we've started to utilize more and more is aerial surveys. In Mendocino, what we're hoping to do is utilize distance sampling to get an estimate of abundance. So to give you a rough idea, so North Coast EMU, so that includes Del Norte and Humboldt counties, when you look at some of these novel techniques with the minimum count data, we get about 2,500 elk. Down in Mendocino, and it's just pretty much in these polygons or these kind of highlighted areas that you see on the map, we have about 1,500. So then I'm going to hand it over to Micaela to kind of finish off and talk about some of the things influencing our populations.
Thank you, Carrington. I think I'd like to just pause here for a minute and just speak about the wonderful team that we have together. I want to say the team that we have doing this work, but I'm really grateful for this collaboration that we here at Cal Poly Humboldt have with CDFW, the California Department of Fish and Wildlife, where Carrington is working because we have come together with efforts and with students to really try and address what you can see on this slide, which is factors influencing the local elk population. So Carrington was brought in to really understand, and she gave you that history of elk that are here on the North Coast. And really, we want to understand how the population is growing, if it's declining, where the challenges are in managing this population. And she has her professional managers have come to work with us at the university to try and answer some of these questions. And I really think that's been some great teamwork. And so what you can see here is that there are a variety of factors that influence the elk population locally. In the center, you really have a hotspot of looking at movements, you can't really see, but looking at movements of collared elk. And the picture below is representing their habitat, their high quality habitat. What is good habitat for elk? And we have measured this for our coastal elk and for our inland elk. And understanding what habitats they prefer is going to help us later for helping manage their movements and reducing conflict, which I'll get to in a few minutes here. And what you see on the left are factors influencing populations that might decrease numbers of elk. So we have traditional hunting that goes on of elk and harvest. We have predation of elk in our area. We have roadkill elk, and we have disease, which are responsible for decreasing the population of elk. And on the right, of course, we have what we call recruitment, but really which is births and immigration into the population. And you might think about these factors and how they weigh their costs and their benefits. And as Carrington mentioned, we are generally seeing the population increasing. What we see with our local elk is that our survival rates are quite high, and our predation rates and even disease, while concerning and something we want to research, are not as high as recruitment. And so as a result, the populations are growing. But next slide will tell us that maybe I was just going to say, maybe the populations aren't growing exactly where we want them to. But I think the next slide, let me tell you about some of these partnerships. So I love that we share with you here that these are a series of projects, and you don't have to read this all. It's being recorded. You can always look back and check. But these are all undergraduate senior students, graduating students in the Department of Wildlife at Cal Poly Humboldt who have done their research projects on elk. And if you click again, you'll see I've highlighted some of the areas that they've studied. They've studied feeding behavior and diet. They've looked at glucocorticoids, so stress in these elk. They've looked at the behavior of elk in forested areas and in open areas. They've looked at parturition, so looking at where they give birth and when. They've looked at the effects of fire and parasites. And we've been doing this looking at watching elk, or also using cameras, as Carrington mentioned, camera photos and videos. And more recently, we've been looking at road crossings, and I'll tell you a little bit more about that. But in the next slide, you'll see that we've also shared advising of quite a few graduate students now. So in the history of Carrington and I working together, we have co-advised these, well, with other folks I should mention as well, partners at Cal Poly Humboldt. These 7 graduate students, one of them, Brielle, is a current graduate student, and they've been looking at, again, if you'll click the next, just highlighting habitat selection, calf survival, disease. What's been really fun, Carrington mentioned the looking at the scat, is actually being able to count elk using the scat. So you can see 2 students have worked on these fecal DNA projects. And we've also been trying to reduce conflict of elk in the region. So Ashley was looking at where do elk move in areas with conflict, and Brielle is looking at where do they cross the road. So if we have a look at the next slide, so thanks to Carrington is controlling. Oh yeah, these are some publications that, in the currency of academia, we like to make sure, and really the department does too, wants us to share the information that we learn with the scientific community, as well as with the public through these types of lectures. And so these graduate students have published from this collaborative research. Next slide. So you've heard a little bit about these local elk, and you may also have heard that with this increasing population, we do find that we have an increase in the population of elk. And so we do tend to find that our coastal elk are highly habituated to people because they're here, they're visited by tourists, they're beloved by people who live here as well. And we find that with that habituation comes an increase in conflict. So either they're getting into places and involved with people who aren't as appreciative of them on the landscape. And in this slide, you see that tourists are visiting areas where the elk are, and there can be aggressive interactions. And here with our local residents, we have potential conflicts with ranchers because the elk might be eating forage that the cows are eating. They might come into conflict in the orchards. They also do damage, as you can see in some of these pictures, to fences, and of course are dangerous when they might get involved in wildlife vehicle collisions. So right around, we have, I guess the next slide, we have some hot spots around. One thing that we're doing that's kind of novel is we're getting all of this information on the population of elk around, and we're looking at these densities, and we're looking at the areas in which they range in order to understand where we might have greater conflict. And can we target management of these populations such that we can, next slide, increase elk habitat where they are welcome, right, in public lands and protected areas, so we can support increasing populations. And that picture is a beautiful picture of the Bald Hills, where we can support lots and lots of elk, but then at the same time, reduce conflict and manage habitat in a way that makes it less attractive for elk, so that we can reduce that conflict. So in the next slide, these management objectives that have been outlined in the CDFW elk management plan is that we should, and I'll just paraphrase, these are a little bit wordy here, but that we monitor the elk populations and really work to restore and enhance suitable elk habitat. So really make the elk want to be where their habitat is most suitable, ideally out of conflict areas. And that includes, in goal 2, having a harvest regime. So we're considering the environmental and social and economic factors. People also do want to hunt elk, and there is subsistence that they get from hunting elk. And also this could reduce elk conflict to achieve our objectives of maintaining healthy populations of elk. Ultimately, we do want to reduce human elk conflict. and try and keep elk from occupying those areas where they're not really welcome. Because even when we've had, and I've attended open town halls that Carrington and her colleagues have held, that we are really listening to the conflict. And these ranchers, when they say there's conflict with elk, it's not that they don't like, they love having the elk around and on their property. But when it is a conflict for them, it's an economic hardship. We hear that, and we need to try and make it so that we have a place for elk on this landscape. And finally, of course, we want to foster cooperative relationships with tribes, acknowledging that elk are on their land, that we're all on land that has been traditionally represented with the tribes, and that they also want to partake in both harvest and management of elk as they move across these boundaries. So next slide is we've been focusing lately, and this is sort of the new work that Carrington and I have been working with CalTrans in an exciting new project that you may have heard about, got a little bit of press here in the fall as the money came through, to establish an early detection system that we want to help understand where elk are crossing the road and keep vehicles, people, and the elk safe. So this system will detect when elk are close to the road. There'll be a changeable message sign which alerts motorists to the hazards. And of course, the aim is to protect both the motorists and elk. I think I have a little bit more information in the next couple slides. So here, thanks to Brielle, who's been mapping all of these crossings and is going to be doing some really exciting work looking, again, thanks to Carrington, she has collared all of these elk, and she's shown you some of those photographs and talk about those data. Understanding all of these little orange lines are where a couple of females are crossing the road by Stone Lagoon, just to orient you to this picture. And so, as Carrington said, every 6 hours, she gets a point on these elk. And Brielle has here drawn lines between points showing you how often, how much time they're spending around the roads. So we know where these hotspots are, and we're trying to find solutions that will work for elk and motorists and landowners in those areas, and also ideally help other wildlife. So it looks something like this. And the next slide. We've got the Highway 101, and we have collared elk, and these elk collars transmit a signal. And then you can kind of see these little posts along the road that we're going to establish. This is going to be a test system that we're going to establish up near Oric, and at one of those hotspots that you just saw. And there will be receivers on the roadway. And as elk walk towards the roadway, these road receivers will pick up the elk signal. And then that sign up on the upper right is one of those changeable message signs that'll say, be alert for elk, or watch out for elk, or elk on the road. We're getting the perfect words to put on that sign. And that sign will only be lit when elk are actually near the road, so that in the bottom picture, you can see that the elk will be able to cross safely. The motorists will be alerted to elk, will be able to slow down, and that this will be an efficient way to take care of elk crossing the road. And the next slide, what's so exciting is this is a test system that we're trying out. We're hoping that it gets established this summer. But what it has triggered is interest by other people who are interested in road ecology and wildlife crossings. And now we're going to be also looking at other considerations. So you might be familiar with the bottom picture. That's the Lewis-Annenberg crossing that's going up in Southern California, a beautiful crossing that's going to connect two habitats over the freeway. And that's being established, again, mainly for mountain lions, but it's going to be able to accommodate many, many species of wildlife. Those are very expensive. They're beautiful, they're effective, and expensive. Maybe in the center picture, we have large culverts that elk and deer might also choose to go, and we might be able to build passages under the roadway. Alternatively, on the left, you see a deer crossing the road, but we are working with new technologies to establish what we're calling electronic crosswalks. So as if there were a zebra crossing there, we would put a detection for wildlife in the form of a camera. maybe a thermal camera that actually detects wildlife that are about to cross the road. And then similarly, an electronic changeable message sign comes up and warns motorists that there's going to be an animal crossing the road. And that wouldn't need a collar on every animal, right? So elk are big, we're able to collar them, but it's not all animals that will be triggering that system. So we're really happy. So next slide. This is work that I say we are a good team. This is work done in huge partnerships with so many people that have worked both to public lands and private lands that have allowed us to work on their property, state parks, the national parks, the tribal entities, the Yurok tribe and the rancherias and the people that we have worked with collaboratively. The Green Diamond Resource Company has been wonderful with, again, allowing us access and working closely with CDFW, with share hunts, and also with management of good habitat. And the tribes are working to make areas welcoming, again, habitat restoration so that they can have elk on their traditional lands. And Rocky Mountain Elk Foundation, of course, has provided some very critical funding support. And we just really couldn't do it without this full partnership. So
And
the next
one
slide.
thing I would like to add, I mean, we have a ton of wonderful partners. The majority of the elk on the landscape are on private property. They're in neighborhoods, they're on ranches, and we couldn't do the work that we're doing without the wonderful community that we have here on the coast.
Absolutely. And we could put all their names on. Sometimes we
Right.
have put all their names when we've done certain studies. Our students have put every name of every landowner who's let them walk on their property because we are really grateful for that. We often put cameras on their property. And so what may feel like an intrusion really, hopefully, and they see that we're getting a lot of information for which we can inform all of this elk research and management. So Carrington, do you want to mention maybe here what these are
Yeah,
about?
so we have what we call the WIR, or the Wildlife Incident Reporting System. That's typically for animals that are injured or for situations where animals are causing conflict or property damage. But it's a way for someone to report what's happening on the landscape, and we do listen. I get emails all the time from this system if we have, a sick elk. And then also we utilize data from the public. So if you see elk and you have the capacity to count them, go online and report that. And you can even upload photos. And then over time, it actually will reflect on a map. So you can visualize all that data and see where elk are being sighted within that area. Questions?
So yeah, we are happy to answer questions. We wanted to give you our story, also keep it not too long so that we can have some time for questions.
Great, thank you, Micaela and Carrington. That was fascinating. So yeah, I'd like to change the security settings now to allow people to start their own video and to also unmute themselves. And people are still welcome to use the chat as well to seed questions. And so there are a couple questions in the chat that came in during the presentation. You might have touched on one already, but I'm going to read them both and see if you have anything more to say. Why are elk so often found in the town of Orick? And how does a researcher get a collar on an elk?
So in the town of Orick, we have two distinct herds. We have what I call Orick, or it's Osok for the old operations center, and we have the Davison herd. So that Davison herd is actually the remnant population that was at Prairie Creek. So they're just highly habituated elk, and they have wonderful forage there where they're grazing cattle. And so they just stay there. How do I get a collar on? I utilize immobilization drugs. So I dart elk and they go down in about 10 minutes, and we monitor vitals, and basically take all these biological samples, put the collar on, and then I reverse the drugs, and within 10 minutes, they're up and running away.
Great. So yeah, folks, don't be shy. This is a great time to, you can either use the raise hand feature down on the bottom of your screen, or just come off your camera and ask questions. I guess the question I had is, when you were listing the numbers that are existing now for both the Thule and the Roosevelt elk, was that in California alone, or is that, I know the Thule are only in California, but with the Roosevelt elk, did those numbers include populations further north of California?
So no, the estimates right around 6,000 are just for California.
Gotcha. And so with how low they got with, I believe you said it was as little as 5, individuals at one point for the Roosevelt elk. Is genetics an issue with the population dropping so small, and were there adverse effects? I mean, clearly they're rebounding, but wondering if you could speak more to that.
I actually don't know enough about Thule elk genetics. I know there was an extensive kind of breeding program where they were moving elk from different populations, but clearly we were only left with 5. So I'm assuming that was a concern, but I'm not certain of the data on that.
Gotcha. And now that they're interbreeding, is that considered a new subspecies, or what do they consider the offspring of these?
So no, it would not be a new subspecies, but you would assume historically that this hybridization of the subspecies did occur. And so it is something that the department is not going to hinder, right? So we're going to allow these populations to expand, and they're going to hybridize where they hybridize.
Gotcha. And in terms of like the collaring, like with the herd that's in Sinkyone and Whitethorn, like what percentage of that herd is collared?
Only 2.
Wow.
Yeah, we collared 2 very early on. I want to say in 2018, maybe. One of those individuals, her collar dropped. So they have release mechanisms that actually pop the collar open and then the collar falls off. The other cow, she died from old age. And then this fall, I went out and collared 2 more individuals.
And are they generally females that you collar, or is it both?
Normally, I collar females because they're the driving force of the population. And so what you can do, if you know the survival of the collared cows and you have a calf cow count, you can estimate basically the growth of the population. But bulls, it's a little more complicated to collar the bulls because the technology for the collars needs to accommodate the how the neck grows during rut. And so I have collars on hand now, and we're going to try it out to see how well they work.
And so you are looking to collar as many as you can, or
only 5 Thule and 5 Roosevelt, and we'll see how they work. And if we get really good data and the collars work well, we'll probably collar more.
So what's neat about these elk, oh, sorry.
go
I
ahead.
just wanted to follow up and mention that as people recognize when they see large groups of elk, is that there are herding species. And Carrington mentioned trying to identify what is a herd of elk. And we try and call them groups because we're still trying to understand the herds, because they split and come back together seasonally. But so what she's found is that as a herding species, they're social, they spend time together. And when you put collars on 2 females, they're a good representative for that group. And so we are kind of interested. We're going to put a few more collars on this Oric herd to test this system. But generally you'll find that the 2 collared females, they are always together or within a day of each other in space and time. So really you don't need to collar half of the females in a herd because they really are sticking together. Males, of course, it's kind of interesting to look at how males are moving across the landscape. It'll be a little bit different. But with the 2 callers per group is something kind of a standard that's been going because the groups tend to stick together.
Great. So we got another question in the chat, and that is, have you projected growth into the future, assuming current population increase over time? Any danger of carrying capacity max, or would hunting kills be a limiting factor in future growth?
We have, I don't know that the data that we utilized was the best because it was early on in the project. It's something that I would like to re-examine. I'm not certain I would look at it in regards to carrying capacity, just because there's a lot of the landscape that, even though it would be conducive in a habitat model for elk, the current land uses are not suitable for elk, right? So we are utilizing hunting currently to reduce population numbers in certain areas. So we have had the capacity to decrease some herds by up to a third in areas of conflict and high density. And so that will likely continue. So, but as a whole, our population, so that would just be one herd. Our population as a whole is continuing to grow and expand at our current harvest levels.
And if I may follow up, I'd also like to say that that notion of carrying capacity is so tricky. I'm going to follow up with Carrington here, that when you're looking at the population as a whole, we can sustain growth in that population, but that the message we were talking about today is we understand that there's conflict and we're trying to reduce that conflict where it arises, making other areas more suitable for the growing population. And as someone who teaches the next generation of managers, I talk about how that concept of carrying capacity is so tricky, because are you talking about along the whole North Coast, or are you talking about in someone's backyard, right? It's delicious forage, but they don't want 100 elk there. They hang out there, but there's a large area. Elk do roam across large home ranges, and if they're finding conflict, for example, in someone's backyard or ranch, we hope we can encourage them to go to an area in another part of their home range, which is also highly suitable. So we can sustain the numbers of elk. They're just concentrating in areas perhaps where, again, they're not preferred.
Gotcha. And so with the elk tags, is that those are specific, if somebody was to get an elk tag for hunting, those are specific to certain areas, or for instance, like in southern Humboldt, northern Mendocino, with like the Sinkyone herd, is a tag, valid there outside of the state park, or is that more, or is it specific to a more hyper localized area?
It depends on the type of tag. So we have general tags that are specified for antlerless, antler, or either sex, and those you can fill pretty much anywhere. So on public lands, like including the BLM, Forest Service, and on private property, assuming access. We also have share tags, which are very specific to a particular property. So those tags are up for lottery, which is really nice because every single person has an equal chance of drawing one of those tags. And it's a way to provide public opportunity to hunt. It also allows some hunting pressure on these private properties that are experiencing a lot of conflict and damage. And so those hunts are outlined for that particular property. And so the majority of our share hunts actually within the state for elk exist along the North Coast. And we are hopeful to get actually the capacity to have more of those hunts to really target some of these high conflict herds.
Interesting. Another question that came into the chat is, are mountain lions a predation issue problem for elk?
In the research we did see some lion predation on calves. Bears actually were higher, and human-caused mortality was leading cause. So hunter harvest and roadkill.
And then going back a bit,
also,
go ahead, sorry. Go ahead.
I'd also like to follow up that, we see that we have these elk in the habituated elk on the coast that spend a lot of time around people. Their predation levels, their mortality levels in general are lower. So that's why we're seeing these high, these population increases and these high survival rates in areas where they're living with closer to people, which reduces a bit of their predation pressure.
Right. And so with the bull elks, do you have a sense of how far they are traveling from the herd? I mean, we've seen reports in southern Humboldt of people seeing elk in places that they haven't seen them for decades. This past summer, Elk Ridge and Salmon Creek, somebody saw a bull elk up here. I don't know if that was reported, but that was really interesting and surprising to hear. And I guess I wonder, where an elk like that might be coming from as far as the central herd.
So that elk is probably coming from the Kings Range, from Sinkyone. We have documented dispersal events in cow elk, not as far as the bulls though. So we were collaring and ear tagging calves for 3 years, and we had a calf move, so tagged as a baby. And then we found him, wow, I believe it was 4 herds further south, several years later. So
Wow.
the bulls just move quite a bit more.
Gotcha. Interesting. So yeah, I'd like to remind everybody is still you can put a question in the chat. You can feel free to raise your hand and ask a question. But I've still got a couple more that I guess I'll just throw out there while we see if anybody else comes up. So with this elk the warning system, that's the first of its kind anywhere in the nation that you're
That's a very good question. I guess technically they had a similar system up in Washington, but now that was 25 years ago. And strangely, we know that it was there. We can't get a lot of information on how effective it was. So they had done some similar work. We think the technology will be better now. And let me mention for this particular detection system that there has been that one. And as far as some of the other ones we're thinking about trying, like that electronic crosswalk, there's also been one tested that people can find, like in Arizona, that they've been doing an electronic crosswalk for other types of wildlife, elk being one of them. So I feel like we're trying to build off of the shoulders of some other testers, but that we don't really have good data on that. And we're trying to find what's interesting as I get into this road ecology field and literature is that it really matters. It's specific to your area. So for us, we have great elk habitat on both sides of the road. And so this is unique. And roads of certain sizes and traffic of a certain type. And so we're really trying to find solutions that are going to work for its location. So I should mention, I guess I forgot to mention, CalTrans is interested in potentially putting an overpass in this area from the parks, again, close to Oric. We use Oric as Stone Lagoon. It's a little bit south of actually the town of Oric, but there are also elk north of the town of Oric. And so it might be that an overcrossing structure is really great. Even though they are very expensive, this particular system we're going to test is quite a bit less expensive, but it does require putting collars on elk. So we're weighing financial and other ecological factors that are going to help us decide what's going to be the best for protecting the elk. And in this case, probably more importantly, protecting the motorists.
Right. So do you encourage all elk sightings to be what would you say?
Reported?
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, it's extremely helpful to know locations, especially on herds that aren't collared. And then it really helps to get a maximum count for the year.
Gotcha. So even in places where you see them frequently, like in Whitethorn, where they're expanding their territory, you'd be interested to know when people see them there.
Definitely.
And certainly I mentioned in rare places, like I was mentioning before. And then
It'd be extremely
I guess
helpful, yes.
All right, good to know. And so I don't know if you want to put that in the chat, if that link is easily available, but if so, people might have an easier time picking it up there than from the recording. Otherwise, I encourage people to go back and check the recording.
That's a
I'd
great
like to-
idea. I'll put it in there for you.
Okay,
great.
thank you.
Yeah,
That's
thanks
to
for-
report elk sightings. Great idea.
And so I guess kind of related in terms of some of the other research that the students have been doing, I noticed that you listed some publications. Would those publications be the best place to learn about the student research, or are there other places where people can find out more about that work?
Yeah, so those publications, I always have to admit those those scientific articles are a little bit dry. So we try and relate those to the public in a more palatable way. But even more than those publications are also the student theses, which I guess, yeah, there's even more there. And those are accessible on the Cal Poly Humboldt website, looking for, or someone can just write to me or Carrington, and we can send those publications to them that if they're interested in reading more about it.
Great. Would you be willing to share your email while we're?
Oh
talking
yeah,
about-
sure.
Awesome. So while we're doing that, I guess last call for anybody who's got any questions out there that haven't been addressed yet. Thank you so much for putting that in there. And yeah, it looks like we're at the end of our questions. So on behalf of Friends of the Lost Coast and the Bureau of Land Management King Range National Conservation Area, thank you for tuning in to Lost Coast Lectures. To view the complete archive of recordings from this series, or to learn more about our work inspiring a passion for nature, visit Friends of the Lost Coast online at lostcoast.org.